The Royal Society has existed on and off since 1821. And I think that what we see ourselves as doing now is reasoned, evidence-based, cross-disciplinary research. We're not a learned academy focusing on one area. We're looking for this broader understanding and debates across disciplines on matters of social importance. What could be more important or more toxic than the debate about immigration? Not just in Australia, but across the US, the UK, Europe, Japan, Korea. The politically charged emotional exchanges are fueled by deeply held and often unexamined beliefs about identity, belonging, fairness, history. Rarely is it based on evidence. That's partly because the evidence is hard, it's tricky, it's difficult to work it out. And Abul Rizvi, who has been, since he left being a Deputy Secretary in the Department of Immigration, has spent his time not trying to help us to understand the complexities of the issues of immigration, which I think are really critical. And what he's done is started to bring through to the press and to the other media an understanding of just how complex these ideas are and what the troubles are. And it was he who said to me, let's go for the big question. How many Australians should there be? And I thought that's really important. We can get so stuck in the details of whether we should have another student category or student visa or whatever, and forget that this is a question about our future, the future good of our society. So can we welcome Abul Rizvi?
Thank you, Christy, and thank you for the introduction. What I'll try to do is, I'm sorry to start off with some boring stuff, definitions, and then I'll talk a little bit about data, and then I'll try to frame the issues in this space, essentially to try to get us all thinking, okay, if you were the Prime Minister or the Immigration Minister, what would an immigration plan for Australia look like? Now you might think, don't we already have a plan? Well, actually we don't. None of the major parties have a plan, and whilst the current government, prior to the last election, said they would develop a plan, they have subsequently decided that's not a good idea, and apparently we're not going to have a plan because why would we plan our future population? I mean, what would be the point of that? So let's start with how we measure population growth, and pretty obviously there's natural increase, which is births minus deaths, and there's net overseas migration, which is net overseas migration arrivals minus departures. Add them together and that gives us population growth. Pretty simple. But there are two crucial definitions in this space that the media and often the politicians consistently seem to jumble up. The first is the migration and humanitarian programs. What they are is the number of permanent visas issued irrespective of whether the person is already in Australia. They may have been here for 10 years and we grant them permanent residence, and at that point we count them. Or they might get a permanent resident visa when they're overseas and we count them then as well. We don't count them in terms of movements, we count them in terms of the official process of granting them a permanent visa. Not a temporary visa, a permanent visa. Around 60 to 70% of people who are granted a permanent visa are already in Australia. If you went back 30 years, very few people would have already been here when they're granted a visa. Very few. So that has switched very significantly. The other thing that you'll find politicians will then jumble up is net overseas migration. Net overseas migration measures the number of people who arrive in Australia, so we're now talking about movements, not visas, we're talking about movements. And movements include Australian citizens, New Zealand citizens, indeed anybody who arrives in Australia and stays in Australia for 12 months out of 16. They are counted as a net overseas migration arrival. Anyone who has been in Australia for 12 months out of 16 and then leaves Australia and remains out of Australia for 12 months out of 16 is counted as a net migration departure. The difference between those two numbers gives you net overseas migration. In the period since COVID, the big increase in numbers was in net overseas migration. Permanent migration actually remained relatively constant. Now, there are consequences from that, and there are consequences that the government doesn't seem to be keen to think about, but there are consequences of having a static permanent migration program and a booming net overseas migration. You can probably work out what the consequences are, but we don't seem to talk about it very much. The other thing you'll find in the immigration debate is that most people will think about immigration through a single lens. And at the moment, the big lens is housing. But it's not always been housing. The other big lens that's recently emerged is inflation. Inflation went up, must have been immigration. Very little evidence to support that view, but, you know, anyone can make up a story. And if it suits your particular bent in terms of politics, you make the story. I think there's very little evidence, actually, that the recent increase in inflation was due to immigration, but you'll find a number of politicians are actually saying that right now. If you're considering immigration policy, and you're fundamentally considering population policy, really, there are two ways to look at it. One is to look at it top-down, and that is in terms of the aggregates. What is the aggregate impact on demography? What is the aggregate impact on the economy? What is the aggregate impact on the budget? What is the aggregate impact on infrastructure, etc.? And you can consider all of those impacts, and you might come up with a view on what the level of net overseas migration should be against all of those factors. On the other hand, you need to also look at it bottom up. And that's looking at it in terms of specific visa categories and asking the question, is this a visa category we should still have? And if so, how should we design it? And how many places should it have? All of those factors drive things like industry and skill sector needs, regional and geographic issues, family migration, humanitarian migration, climate migration. We now have a climate visa. You may not have heard of it, but we do have a climate change visa now. Obviously, issues of social cohesion, geopolitical defence issues, trade issues, all of those things go into the annual consideration of what our program, our migration program, should be. The government is starting the consultation process now for the 26-27 program. In April, that will go to Cabinet, and in May, the budget, they'll make an announcement. What they won't tell us, though, is a long-term plan. They'll just tell us the migration and humanitarian program for next financial year. No more.
No student visa.
I'm sorry?
No student visa.
Oh, yes, there's student visas. The industry and sector skill needs. The international education industry is a big industry in Australia. Okay. The first place you start, I think, in considering levels of immigration is from a demographic perspective. And there are two factors you have to take into account when you think about this. A higher level of net migration with diminishing returns, so each additional level of net migration will get you a benefit from an ageing perspective. That is, the portion of people over 65 relative to the portion of people under 65, because the vast bulk of net overseas migration is people under 65, net overseas migration effectively slows the ageing process. It doesn't stop it, it just slows it down. And the question is, what is an acceptable rate of ageing? what might be too fast rate of ageing, or perhaps a too slow rate of ageing, whichever way you want to look at it. But the higher the level of net migration, the slower the rate of ageing. And of course, ageing has multiple consequences from a societal, from an economic perspective, from a health ageing, etc., etc. The other thing that a higher level of net migration does is pushes out the point at which deaths exceed births in Australia. At the moment, births exceed deaths in Australia by about 100,000 per annum, a bit over. Depending on the level of net migration we have, we either push that point out into the future or we bring that point forward. And you, as a policymaker, may have a view, well, should we reach that point faster or should we reach that point more slowly? And people have views on that, quite legitimate different views on that. Some people may think, well, we should get to the point where deaths exceed births faster. There are implications from that, obviously, and people need to think about that, but sometimes people don't. They just come up with an immigration number and think, well, who cares? Lower net migration accelerates ageing and brings forward the point where deaths exceed births. And in many ways, if we are choosing the question, how many Australians should there be, you're really choosing those three things. That is the level of net migration, the rate of population ageing, and the point at which deaths exceed births. Because they will eventually exceed, deaths will eventually exceed births. That's going to happen, although for Australia it may happen later than most countries, but it will happen. So the other thing you need to look at this from a macro perspective is the global context. Because of our relatively higher level of net migration over the last 25 years, we are amongst the youngest developed nations on the planet. Now, you may have different views on whether being young or old is good or bad. That's fine. People have different views on that. Generally speaking, a relatively younger population tends to be a positive in terms of both budget and the economy. In other aspects, you might think, well, what do we need young people for? They're just brash, forget about that. Intelligent, wise, older people are obviously far better. That's fine. People can have that view. Our median age is 38. Our births exceed deaths, as I said, by about 100,000 per annum. That gap will close. Slowly, but it will close. Canada is a good country with which us to compare ourselves because we are quite similar to Canada. We have had immigration policies very similar to Canada for a long, long time. Canada's median age is 42. And you might think, 42, 38, yeah, that's pretty close. Actually, 4 years makes a very big difference. Canada, even though it has a fertility rate very similar to Australia, is already in a situation where deaths exceed births. And why do deaths exceed births in Canada and not in Australia? Because they're older than us. And being older means you're likely to have more deaths and fewer births. And just 4 years between us and Canada makes that difference. So it doesn't take long before you get to the point where deaths exceed births. Our major trading partners, and we often think about our major trading partners because they're people who we sell most of our stuff to, and they're the people from whom we buy most of our stuff. Our major trading partners are all much older than Canada, and they all have shrinking populations. So Japan, for example, shrinks by about 1 million per annum. And you might think, a million, it's all right, they can cope. They've got 120 odd million, long time before you run out of people. But 1 million per annum is substantial. Japan also has a median age of about 48, 49 and rising. If you thought 38 to 42 made a difference, imagine being at 48 or 49. China, and you might think, 1.4 billion people, where's the problem? Well, on its current policy settings, it doesn't have much immigration, China. It's been a country of emigration for the last 50 years. China's population will probably halve by the end of the century. Think about that. 1.4 billion to just over 700 million. And the end of the century, you might think, oh, that's ages away. 75 years, you know. Our grandchildren will be around then. Well, mine hopefully will be anyway. I don't know about yours. Most European nations rely on immigration to prevent population decline. Now, all of the stories you'll hear about it is about how horrible immigration is, but ask the Treasury departments of those countries and they will tell you a different story. They are heavily reliant on immigration to prevent or to offset the impact of the fact that their deaths exceed births. I've got here France and UK to follow suit. Actually, France and UK are already following suit. That happened this year. This stuff does move slowly, but it does move. What that means is over the next 20, 30 years, whilst at the moment we might say, well, we can get any number of immigrants we want, no problems at all. Over the next 20 to 30 years, to attract a highly mobile, intelligent, high-achieving immigrant over the next 20 or 30 years will change. It will not be so easy, simply because the competition amongst our trading partners will change. The other thing you should note is that almost all of those European nations, and China, and Japan, and South Korea, now and increasingly so rely on overseas students to their countries with a pathway to permanent residence for those students. In other words, they're doing exactly what we did or started to do 30 years ago. So when people tell you we don't need overseas students, ask them what these other countries are doing. So, I'm sorry about this cloud of numbers, but I'll just go through it very quickly. You don't need to read all the numbers. This is a brief history of NOM, and I'm into the history of NOM, as you can see. The first thing I'll start with is 2014-15, 2015-16, and you'll see NOM in 14-15 was 184,000. In the last 20 odd years, that's quite low, leaving aside COVID. COVID's always an exception. Why did NOM fall so much in 2014-15, 2015-16? The unemployment rate increased to 6%. Australian citizens started leaving the country at a rapid rate. 25,000 net left the country in 14-15 in search of better job opportunities elsewhere. If the labour market is weak in Australia, net migration falls of its own accord. The other thing that happened was with New Zealand citizens. New Zealand citizens, I'd need a bigger table, but if you went back further, you'd find the volume of New Zealand citizens coming into the country was close to 30 and 40,000 in earlier years. That was before New Zealand's labour market improved. In 14-15, 15-16, New Zealand had a significantly lower unemployment rate. New Zealand citizens said, don't need to go to Australia, I can get a good job here. And a lot of the New Zealand citizens who were already here in Australia said, wow, home's looking pretty good. I'll go back and get a job there. They did. You can see what's happened to New Zealand citizens in recent years. Two things happened to get that result. Our labour market strengthened. Our unemployment rate was much lower than in New Zealand in those latter years, and we had record numbers of New Zealand citizens coming to the country. The other thing that happened was the Labor government changed policy. In 2001, the Howard government introduced a policy which said you cannot get Australian citizenship unless you first apply for and are granted a permanent resident visa. So you had to actually come through that permanent resident visa process. And what that did was slow the rate at which New Zealand citizens were coming to Australia, because it cut them out from access to a range of government services, and it cut them out from access, or direct access, to citizenship. 2 years ago, the government changed policy and said New Zealand citizens no longer need to go through the permanent residence process. After 4 years, and as long as you've not been naughty, you can get Australian citizenship. As a result, we see the boom. The other thing you can see here is, once again, leave aside the COVID period, the big increase in students, the steady increase from 14-15 until just before COVID. And that would have continued had there not been COVID. We then had COVID, and then we had another big surge. The reasons for the big increase: we changed student visa policy in 13-14. I won't go into the details of what we changed, but we changed policy to make it a lot easier to grow the student numbers. So the numbers grew. Immediately after COVID, or at the end of COVID, we stomped on the student accelerator. We said to students, you can have unrestricted work rights. You can work as long as you like. And you may have to study a bit occasionally, but we won't be worrying too much about that. You can have unrestricted work rights, work as many hours as you like. We said you can apply for a student visa without paying an application fee. I was really surprised at that, because I spent my first 10 years in the Department of Finance, and the idea of giving anyone fee-free anything was abhorrent, but they did it anyway. They established what was known as the COVID visa, which for students looked really attractive, because it meant, hey, hang on, you mean I can stay in Australia with unrestricted work rights, and I don't have to study, I don't have to pay tuition fees? Sounds pretty good. And so we had over 150,000 people say, oh, I'll have that. And it happened. What that all led to was that massive boom in net overseas migration. Oh, by the way, we also substantially changed how the working holiday maker visa worked to make it much, much easier to get a long stay working holiday visa in Australia. We made lots of changes that facilitated that, and you can see the impact of that. Now, this will be the last of these slides, so please bear with me. This is the permanent program. Remember, this is visas granted. And you can see the total permanent program, including humanitarian, was quite a bit smaller prior to COVID. In 2021, see that big jump in family visas in 2021? That big jump occurred not because of COVID. Some people have suggested it was because of COVID. It wasn't. What happened was the government, prior to that, held back the number of places for partner visas. Now, a partner visa is a visa that your son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter, if they happen to marry someone from another country and they wanted to live in Australia, they would apply for a partner visa. Partner visas are very special in the migration program because the law enables the government to cap all visas, but not partner visas. The law explicitly says you cannot limit the number of partner visas. Prior to that big boom, the government was, in my view, illegally capping partner visas. Following some intense pressure from the current Assistant Minister Julian Hill, who wrote to the Auditor-General and said, this is illegal, you should investigate, the Auditor-General eventually said, OK, I'll investigate. If you were the minister, newly appointed Minister Alex Hawke, and you were told, the Auditor-General is about to investigate partner visas and we're breaking the law, what do you want us to do? He said, what do you mean we're breaking the law? So he said, process them, get on with it. And hence you have that big jump in 2021. The government decided we'll stop breaking the law, which was a good idea. I commend them on that. Subsequently, the government went back to limiting the number of partner visas. Now, the website says they manage them on a demand-driven basis, but by the end of this financial year, the backlog of partner visa applications will be about 120,000. Every year, about 65 to 70,000 partner visa applications are received. Anyone want to guess how many partner visa places there are? 40,000. Now, in my maths, that doesn't work. At some stage, either this government or a future government is going to have to come clean and say, we'll stop breaking the law again. It might be this year, might be next year, but it's going to have to be at some stage, because if you keep letting that happen, there'll be a class action and the government will lose, flat out. In fact, if there was a class action, the government would start processing those visas very quickly in order to avoid being found guilty. So whilst the government has increased the total permanent program, the size of net overseas migration that took place in 22, 23, 24, 23, 24 is moving through the system. And it eventually runs into the brick wall of the permanent program, which is strictly limited. What happens when it runs into the brick wall? Well, the applications just bank up, and they keep banking up. And this is not just partner applications, it's lots of other applications that are just banking up. Eventually, that brick wall will break. It'll either break for legal reasons or it will break for political reasons, but it will break. Treasury's net overseas migration forecasts. These are both the forecasts they made prior to the election, so these are the forecasts the government took to the election. Note, they're forecasts, they're not targets. The government doesn't have a target because it doesn't have a plan. It has, Treasury does these forecasts, but these are sort of, boffin forecasts. They come up with these numbers and the government said, meh, so what? I suspect, though, the politics of this is changing. I suspect the government can't just keep saying, meh, they're just Treasury forecasts. And, they're back in Appendix A of Budget Paper 3, and no one ever gets to Appendix A of Budget Paper 3. Well, people are starting to get to Appendix A of Budget Paper 3, and they look at these numbers and they think, are they plausible? In my view, those numbers are not plausible. Let's have a look at the Treasury population scenarios. Let's accept that their forecasts will be realised. Our population at the end of March, 27.5 million, projected to be 31.5 million by 35-36 and 41 million by 65-66. My sister-in-law made a joke about, that's very close to 42. That assumes the fertility rate will rise from 1.42 births per woman, that's the lowest fertility rate we've ever recorded, to 1.62 births per woman. That's possible, it could happen. But governments have a very long history, and I'm not just talking about the Australian government, I'm talking about governments around the world, have a very long history of predicting a rise in fertility and it not happening. I'll come back to Peter Costello's baby bonus later if people want to talk about that. The assumption is that long-term net overseas migration will be 235,000. That will mean that natural increase will gradually fall. As you know, if you keep NOM at a certain level, natural increase, that is births minus deaths, gradually falls. And they're suggesting it will fall to 69,000 per annum by 65-66. That will certainly mean we are the only developed nation on the planet where births exceed deaths. By far. Every other, on current policy settings, every other developed nation, including Canada, including the United States, will have deaths exceeding births by then. but we won't. Now, you might say that's a good thing. You might say that's a bad thing. That's a matter for people to make judgments on. Our median age will rise to 43.7 by that stage. The reason deaths won't be exceeding births by that stage will predominantly be because of net overseas migration. Our old age dependency ratio, that is the portion of people over 65 divided by the number of people of working age, will rise from just under 27 to just under 39. As I said earlier, we can get to those numbers faster or more slowly, depending on what we choose to do with net overseas migration. And it's for that reason I think it's important to have a plan around this. But no political party in Australia, I think, will do that, which is pretty sad. Why do I think Treasury's forecasts are problematic? Two reasons. One is Treasury's long-term net migration forecast is based on the average of net overseas migration in the 14 years prior to COVID. You might think, what's that got to do with the future? Actually, it doesn't have a lot to do with the future. And that's because policy today is very different to policy pre-COVID. 5 main differences. The permanent program is bigger. We changed policy on New Zealand citizenship to make it easier for them to get Australian citizenship. We tightened student policy, but we've increased the planning level this year. There's a lot of confusion around that at the moment. The number of people who get skilled temporary work, the skilled temporary work experience requirement, that's for the temporary skilled work visa, was reduced to 1 year. As a result, combined with a very strong labour market, demand for that visa is booming, despite the massive costs that have to be paid to get that visa. And finally, our working holiday maker arrangements have never been so facilitative. For those 5 reasons, I don't think the government will get to the Treasury forecasts. What does that mean? Well, at the moment it doesn't mean a lot because it will be some time before we know the outcome for net overseas migration for 25-26 and for 26-27. But we'll be pretty close to knowing those outcomes by the time of the next election. Opposition politicians will argue, you promised net migration would fall to these levels, you broke your promise. In the current political atmosphere around immigration, I don't think the government wants to be there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Abul. That's been absolutely riveting. Can I just ask, why are we stuck with net migration as a metric? It seems to me a particularly unilluminating one. If we think about the worries that we have about net migration, it's not about identity. It's got nothing to do with whether these people see themselves as Australian citizens. It doesn't have anything to do with all of the issues that we think are important. So why are we stuck with net migration as the metric?
There has to be a metric to measure changes in population due to immigration. You can think of different metrics. So, for example, we could, rather than use the 12 months out of 16 months rule, move to a different rule. We could do 24 months out of 30 months or whatever. We could choose whatever we wanted because we're open to do so. We use the metric as we do at the moment mainly because statistical agencies around the world all agreed this would be the metric, and that's why we use it. There has to be a metric. You can't have zero metric. No. There has to be a metric. Yes, you can debate the metric. The statisticians have come up with 12 out of 16. Could you think of something else? Yes, of course you could. We could be inconsistent with the rest of the world. No, okay, Do we want to be?
No,
I doubt it.
Okay, so if we move back then and think, how big should we be? I was told, but not reliably, that Rudd had an idea that we should be 60 million. what on earth was driving that? And what do you think we should have as the size of Australia? And is that number important?
I'll answer the last question first.
Yes.
Yes, it's very important.
Yeah, okay.
Why did Rudd come up with that?
Yeah.
I won't be giving away too many secrets if I was to say every time the Department of Foreign Affairs is asked for a view on the level of immigration, of all departments, it always comes up with the biggest number. Why? Because it doesn't want to be a middle power, it wants to be a bigger than middle power. And being in the room with
all universities want to be bigger because they want to be
They
higher.
want to be the biggest and the best, of course they do. And DFAT has always had that view.
Right.
There's no logic to it.
No.
It's just, and
So
there's no arithmetic or anything.
What would be your number? I mean, obviously there are all the factors about how big Australia is, our climate change, all of the issues that we're trying to cope with. I think that your argument, if I understood it, was that, boy, do we need that net migration if we're going to manage to look after our old people.
Yes, we do.
And that seems to, and it, you know, I do remember having a colleague in London who was working on the impact of refugees to a society, and they seem to be so good for a society as well. So if you're measuring those things, so
Let me start at the bottom end, and then I'll ask the question from the top end.
yeah,
Let's assume the government decided that net overseas migration every year should be one.
yes.
One person. And that person should be the archetypal average migrant. What's the average migrant look like? One, they're at the point that they get their permanent residence visa, they're probably about 25.
Yeah.
25 is pretty close to the start of a career. That is a good point to start, to attract someone
Yes.
at the start of their career. It's most likely that person studied in Australia. They paid for their education. We didn't pay for it. They didn't get HECS. They didn't get study support or anything like that. But if they went to work, they paid taxes. But they don't get Medicare.
It does sound pretty brutal, doesn't it?
Well, if you were a businessman, you'd think it was profitable. So that person is probably 25 by the time they get their qualifications and by the time they get permanent residence. They've probably studied in Australia, and in all probability, that person, he or she, will be a nurse.
Right. Well, I mean, that all sounds
Okay.
exactly what we need, doesn't it?
So you might think, wow, why are we limiting it to one? We should have more than one. And you can build up from that number into other qualifications, into other areas of study, whether they studied in Australia or elsewhere, and you could keep expanding that. When do you start to run into problems? You tend to run into problems when the number gets to such a level that complaints to the government about things like congestion, about infrastructure not keeping up, about housing, and those sorts of issues start to become strong, and the government gets nervous.
But if it is a mistake to think that the issue, as you seem to suggest at the beginning, that the issues to do with housing, at least, and inflation are tied to net migration, why can't the government just explain that?
In terms of inflation, I don't think the government's really said anything in that space. It's really been a few people, plus Pauline, who have said it was immigrants who created the inflation, even though the evidence for that is extraordinarily weak. In terms of housing, yes, many factors go into our housing crisis. We've been preparing for this crisis for 20, 30 years through an assortment of pretty poor policies.
Yes.
But right now, a large portion of Australians think immigration increases demand for housing I can't get a rental property, it's the fault of immigrants. It's as simple as that. And you could, clamp down on immigration enormously to make those people happy. Whether that would have a significant impact on housing demand is another question. It would have some impact, no question of that. Whether it would be sufficient to bring house prices down, and I suspect there's a lot of people in this room who own houses, whether it was sufficient to bring house prices down is another question.
Well, there are many other factors there. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. Just, is there a number that you think for Australia?
I think two things. One, if you had a plan, then you could have a number that made sense, assuming the plan made sense. And frankly, I wouldn't be all that fussed what the number was, as long as we had a plan. But whilst we don't have a plan, it's usually the situation that historically, when net migration has got to about 250,000, the complaints become overwhelming. If it's less than 200, the problems in terms of skill shortages start to become significant.
Okay. All right. Now, if we start at the back there, Susan Pond.
Thanks, Christy. Abul, that was a very interesting data set. You talked about developed countries. Talk to us about the immigration policy or the immigration situation in Africa, South America, Middle East. Where are they sitting in this global debate?
That's a good question. I haven't looked closely at the immigration policies of those countries. I tend to look at Canada because Canada's most like us. I tend to look at New Zealand, and to a lesser degree I tend to look at the United States, United Kingdom. I have been following Japan, South Korea and China more in recent times. Those other countries are predominantly countries of net emigration. In terms of recruiting immigrants, they probably don't have significant policy settings. They do lose a lot of immigrants, and it raises the question of, are we being selfish? And that's a perfectly legitimate argument to put. The fact is, we have always run our immigration policy on a very selfish basis. Should governments be more selfish or less selfish? I have no better answer on that than anybody else, I imagine.
Okay. Well, let's go T-bot 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Thanks, Abul. That's brilliant stuff. It's interesting. Africa is the only part in the world where fertility rates are still running above 4, so they've got no problem with immigration. Their populations are growing naturally. My question is about long-term. I don't remember the exact numbers, but you said something about 36 million and then something about 40-something million.
According to Treasury, 41 million by 65, 66.
Okay, all right. My problem is infinite growth. Sooner or later, we're going to reach some sort of natural limit. And I know we want to keep enough young people to look after our old people. I know we want to keep our population pyramid triangular. We want to have the bottom wider than the top. But if you do that, it's endless. You've got infinite growth. So sooner or later, it's going to fall over for natural reasons or whatever. How are we going to cope with that? And how do we plan for that point? We have to prevent that from happening. We don't want that problem. And the only way to do that is to invert the population pyramid. There's no other way to do that. So how do we plan for that?
Right. If we completely inverted the population pyramid, the long-term implication is extinction, not endless growth. In the 60s, I remember two things about the 60s. Hippies, free love, condoms, the pill. And the other thing relevant to population in the 60s was Paul Ehrlich, who said, there is no way we can survive, there is no way we can produce enough food for the human race, and he ran this Malthusian argument that we would all end up dying of starvation. Two things that Ehrlich got wrong. He didn't understand what was happening around him at the time. If he'd looked around him, he would have found, one, an enormous surge in girls going to university and developing careers, and a widespread availability of birth control. Irrespective of what religious leaders said, most girls ignored them. And as a result, the vast bulk of the world now has fertility levels, including India now, less than 2. You're right, Africa has high fertility rate, but even Africa has been falling rapidly. The latest population projections by the United Nations suggest global population peaking around 2080. I suspect the next lot of global population projections will see it peaking earlier. Africa too will eventually become an ageing society. So I don't worry about endless growth so much. And certainly Australia will be different. Australia is very, very different. And the question is, do we want to be that different? And I think the government should make a choice on that. I don't mind what choice they make, as long as they make a choice and explain it. Sorry.
So how far can Australia grow?
If net migration is held at about 235 per annum, I suspect by the end of this century we'll have stopped growing. Deaths will exceed births by more than net migration.
Right, we had 2, 3, 4 here, and then we'll go to the back. 2, 3, 4.
Thank you, Abdul. It's excellent address, yes. I enjoy every moment of it. Now, you didn't mention refugees. Could you perhaps say a few words about the numbers of refugees and special humanitarians and also composition of them? Thank you.
Our humanitarian program at the moment is about 20,000 per annum. Historically, that's high. So generally, on average, over the last 40 years, the average has been around 14. So 20 is relatively high. Of the 20, approximately 2,000 to 3,000 are onshore asylum seekers, successful onshore asylum seekers, not unsuccessful ones. The rest is from overseas. A large portion is from the Middle East and from Burma, Rohingyas, as well as from Africa, a substantial portion from Africa. One other thing that we have done very recently is established what is called the Tuvalu visa. Now, that's not part of the humanitarian program. Oddly enough, it's not counted at all, which is a bit bizarre, and I don't like it when governments play numbers games, but they're playing a numbers game by not counting them. And the number of Tuvalu visas is very small. It's only 270 odd. But it's our first climate change visa. I suspect in the future we may have more climate change visas.
Okay, Robert and then...
Fascinating talk. I think I'm changing my ideas and views, which I probably didn't have many of anyway. My question, though, is that essentially you've given us numbers and without looking at distribution across a very variable continent. And so much of the issues you started with, the top-down infrastructural issues, are very area dependent. We've had a deep repopulation and expansion programs in the past, but it seems to me that we haven't looked at that as extensively and as closely as we should. What is the opportunity, what is the planning for serious expansion throughout the extraordinary continent that we have?
I think in terms of the population generally, we probably haven't had a serious go at decentralisation since Whitlam. Whether a government will have a go at decentralisation in the way Whitlam tried, I don't know. Many people may think he wasn't successful. I think he was partly successful. There are some towns that exist that would not have existed without what Whitlam did. So he was partly successful. I doubt whether any government is going to think about that anytime soon, but it may. From an immigration perspective, for probably close to 30 years, we have now had regional Australia. And remember, regional Australia votes disproportionately for Pauline. We had regional Australia, employers in regional Australia, industry bodies in regional Australia coming to the Department of Immigration saying, our towns are ageing and they're dying out and you have to help us. Sev was doing that work in South Australia 20 years ago. Might have been more than 20 years, I can't remember now, Sev. So we have in place now an absolute abundance of visa categories that try to encourage migrants to go to regional Australia and live there for as long as they're prepared to do so and as long as we're prepared to make rules tough enough to force them to do so. So we have this dilemma. We have Pauline saying, vote for me, I'll cut immigration, and regional employers and regional towns saying, get more migrants into my town, otherwise we're ageing and dying out. The median age of regional Australia is 42. The median age of capital cities is 36. 36. So the cities are much younger than our regional towns. Our regional towns are facing serious shortages in terms of health and aged care infrastructure. And if we're going to slash immigration, I cannot for the life of me imagine a Hanson government slashing all those regional migration programs, because I suspect there may be a reaction to that.
Okay, it was really fascinating. Thank you very much for that. It's a really privilege to this eye-opener, actually. Look, we concentrate, government is concentrating on the numbers, only on, I heard numbers here, numbers there. Don't you think we can make the same mistake like, it's what they're saying actually, government of Germany, when was Chancellor Merkel. She have a big numbers when people was coming from all around the whole world, and they was like a welcome because we are the guest of Miss Merkel. Sweden, Danish government, who is now kicking out these numbers. Don't we supposed to concentrate more maybe on quality, on people who can integrate with us, who can have similar values to our values? I don't want something...
Yep. No. It's a perfectly legitimate question, because there are serious politicians in Australia who are putting that argument. Let me describe to you how we deal with Australian values in the current system, and then you can ask the question, well, how could we deal with Australian values differently? The first point I would make is Australia currently runs a non-discriminatory migration program. We do not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, colour, nationality, etc. Now, a future government may say, no, that's it, we're not doing that anymore, we're going to change. You'd have to make some pretty serious changes, especially if you were going to discriminate on the basis of religion. You'd have to change Section 116 of the Constitution, and it's not easy changing the Constitution. In terms of Australian values, what do we do now? Well, what we do is each time a permanent resident or temporary entrant gets a visa, they must sign a document that stipulates Australian values. Now, we can debate what those values should be. There's a document which lists them, and you can agree or disagree with those values, but they're there. And the applicant must sign the document and say, yes, I believe in these values. We don't actually test them on those values, but they're required to sign. When they apply for citizenship, we put them through a test where we ask them a number of questions which go to Australian values, and they must pass the test. The argument at the moment is that's not good enough. Let's do something else. No one, including all of the people who have said let's do something else, has described what the something else looks like. So, for example, if a person applies for a student visa, do we put them through a test at that point and say, well, let me ask you about Aussie values. Do you believe in the rule of law? And the person says, yes, I believe in the rule of law. Do you believe in democracy? Yes, I believe in democracy. They're the kinds of values that are listed. Yes, we could force them to sit those tests, and we'd probably have to force them to set the tests physically, because if you did it online, you know, people would say, oh, they all cheated. So you'd have to do it physically. So you'd have to find some physical network where they sat these tests, and then someone would have to mark them, and you'd have to make a decision on whether they reflected Australian values. Now, is that what's proposed? I don't know, because the people proposing that we need to adhere more to Australian values haven't told us. They've just said we need more Australian values. I'm just going to wait and see what they come up with.
Let's go. Go to the back.
Thanks very much for that wonderful talk. I always love it when people talk with data. Often we don't have any data and talk a lot. Your talk made me think about the trajectory we're on at a much more broader philosophical level. Now, obviously, we've got to solve the current problems and problems that are easily identified within our horizon. But if you look at a broader perspective of the human species, and I'm actually doing some work on hominin evolution, and at the moment there are many, many more hominin species that have been identified, all of which, except for one, Homo erectus, survived for about 300,000 years before becoming extinct. Now, Homo sapiens has been identified as being around for 300,000 years. To what extent, I mean, if you look further into beyond the horizon of our grandchildren, are we on a trajectory that all the other hominins followed apart from erectus? And no one really knows why these species became extinct. I mean, there's lots of theories, obviously, but not much data.
Look, I haven't got a crystal ball. I can't foretell the future. No. I don't know what's going to happen in 300,000 years. I can't say how much longer the human race will survive. But if you do the arithmetic, within a couple of hundred years, if we keep going on the current trajectory, we'll be very, very old and a lot smaller.
Next question. There was another one at the back there. There it is.
There's a sort of assumption that sits behind some of what you mentioned around the population pyramid and the need for young people to support an aged population. What's the consensus or thinking around the fulcrum of that age shifting back with better healthcare, better technology? So, for example, you know, the typical age people might use is 65. As that career is lengthened to 67, 69, 71, how does that affect the thinking on net overseas migration needs?
Yeah. Oh, look, absolutely. And that change is taking place now. Many people well past the age of 65 remain in the workforce. So that's changing, absolutely. And we should take that into account. In addition, generally speaking, life expectancy continues to rise, at least across all developed nations and probably most developing nations. The odd one out is America, but you know, America's got its own issues, and why its life expectancy is falling, being the richest nation on the planet, is a mystery.
Not really.
Well, mysterious to me anyway. I don't know whether they get shot or not, what happens. But anyway, yeah. And those things will help, no question. AI will help, no question.
Look, can we press you on that? Because I think it's very clear that we're at a position with AI where many things are going to change. Health, work, everything else. And
Yes.
if we're trying not to do the short election term modelling of the future population, but are trying to think for future generations, shouldn't we be thinking hard about, like our grandchildren, shouldn't we be thinking hard about what that place will be like? And it's going to be very different.
Yes, no, undoubtedly true. That's got to be part of the plan.
Okay.
It's got to be part of the plan, absolutely. But I would say a couple of things about that. One is robots don't buy much stuff. And our economy is heavily reliant on us going out there, buying coffee, buying stuff, buying services. That's how our economy works. And that's just not us. It includes communist countries like China. They buy lots of stuff too. And economies depend on consumers. So whilst you may be able to get rid of a lot of workers, you don't want to get rid of all the consumers as well.
Actually, I should go back. The gentleman at the back, do you want to add something to your question? I can't really see you. You're under a bright light.
I don't think there's anything to add. I was more wondering if there's a consensus or a method that typically applies to adjust for that shifting expectation of the fulcrum.
I'm not sure there's a simple method available. Much of it involves trying to predict some quite uncertain things. I mean, yes, I acknowledge what will happen with AI, how fast it will happen, what it will affect, which jobs will go, which jobs will be created. I don't know the answer to those questions.
Yes, a question here.
So, Abul, you pointed out that China, Japan, Korea, the West, major sources of our current migrants, even India, population sort of peaking. That's going to make it potentially much more difficult for us, or it's going to change where we source our migrants from, isn't it? So there's going to be some challenging political issues that's going to generate.
Oh, that's absolutely
Right.
true.
So,
And I doubt government is thinking of that. But it will happen. At the moment, we get about 4,000, 5,000 students a month from China. I don't think we'll be able to sustain that. The competition out of China will get harder. China is building its own international education industry. We will be, rather than extracting students from China, we'll be competing with China. Yeah. And that will probably happen eventually with India and eventually with other places as well. The competition will rise. It's not something governments think about because they only think about, the 24-hour media cycle rather than thinking 40 years ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned climate and climate refugees, but what about those large parts of the planet, including Australia, where significant sections will no longer be livable if climate change continues as it does, as it is at the moment? That surely will be a huge factor in thinking about, one, how many people Australia can have, how many people some of those places, particularly along the tropics, can possibly have, and that that might help account for disappearing human race. What are your thoughts on that, and is there any work going on that in immigration,
Certainly there's work going on in terms of helping nations in the Pacific that may or may not, I think most people think they probably will, be affected by climate change earlier than other places. And so the idea of expanding that Tuvalu visa is certainly something the government has on its agenda. And you know, if climate change was to happen faster, we would need to accelerate how we would think about those visas. In terms of the impact on Australia itself, I can't answer that question. That's not a question for the Immigration Department. That's probably somewhere else, I suspect.
Can I be really quite outrageous and ask Murray Goot, whom I see in the audience and I've not seen to talk to for 20 years. 20 years ago, he was working empirical evidence on nativism and the rise of nativism in Australia. And over these last, well, particularly over the last couple of years, we've seen a rise and rise of anti-global nativist language. Murray, can you possibly tell us how that's going in Australia and what impact the recent years have, since all of those figures have come out, there have been of net migration on Australian attitudes? He's just in there. I know this is naughty, but...
Christy, I'd love to be able to tell you, but one of the problems with the research is it doesn't really... it really doesn't dig into what underlying views are that people have. So we know that immigration is rising as an issue. I'm sure nativism is part of it. That's to say, an opposition to immigration, and more than that, a priority to people in the way we value things in terms of people who've lived in Australia for a long time, who can trace ancestry back in Australia, who have the famous Australian values, and so on. So it's an opposition not only to the rise of immigration, but to its composition. But the polling, apart from telling you that immigration is a rising issue, doesn't actually go very much into what drives that. And that's also true not only of commercial polls, which we see from time to time, but also from the academic research, I think, from the Australian Action Study, from the Australian Social Survey. That work needs to be done and largely hasn't been done.
And what about students? I mean, what is the attitude towards Australian... I mean, maybe this is my question to you. There seems to be there was a push to say international students were taking all of the rental properties and so on, and resentment of the international students, and that was really rather appallingly manifested in COVID, where they were not given support. But do you think that's a general attitude in the population, that students are a problem, international students are a problem?
I think they are certainly presented in the media as a problem. The extent to which our economy profits from overseas students is not well understood, and when it is presented, it's often denigrated. There are certainly issues with our student visa system in terms of the way we're managing the numbers and those sorts of things, but the negativity towards overseas students, I think, doesn't correlate with the economic, budgetary and social benefits we derive from them. And the sad thing is, no politicians seem to be prepared to go out there and say, or explain, I mean, they may say it, but they rarely explain the benefits.
Peter Malinauskas did. I'm not, because of Writers' Week, he's not my favourite politician this week, but he did go out and say, South Australia wants more international students, wants more tech students, and he said it very clearly, and I think that's broadly accepted in...
Yeah, South Australia is a bit different. No. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. South Australia loses more young people than any other state, other than perhaps Tasmania at times. Secondly, South Australia has a significantly older population.
So it needs the youth.
Its situation is very different. In all of the time I was in the Department of Immigration, there was one state that banged on our door harder than every other state, and that was South Australia.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, done.
Thank you for speaking. Maybe in a similar thread, is there anything more that the government or any political party that wants to do to communicate the benefits of immigration or what the cost would be if we were to decrease immigration?
I think we have to go back and actually give the Australian public an idea of where we're going and why we're going there. Now, you might think, well, that's a pretty naive thing to say given what's happening in our politics right now. Frankly, they couldn't be losing more of the polling to One Nation by doing that than they are now, which the strategy at the moment is say nothing, apart from the rare cases where Malinowskis might come out. But our federal politicians are in a situation where the Labor government says, let's say as little as possible, and that apparently is the strategy. They've clearly come out and said we need no plan, which I find extraordinary that a journalist hasn't said, you mean we don't need a plan for our future? Really? I can't believe that question wasn't asked by a journalist when Tony Burke said we're not going to have a plan. You went to the last election saying you'd have a plan. You've got to do better than just say I've changed my mind. I think, and this may be naive, I think the best way forward is sunlight and not darkness.
Susan Pond again.
Plan that you were going to comment on, and that was Peter Costello's one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country. Yes. It was a plan, it was a policy.
Yes, it was.
What are your comments about that?
If you look at the data, and I'm sorry to go back to data, if you look at the data, his baby bonus actually didn't make much difference to our fertility rate. Our fertility rate did go up, but it was already going up before he introduced the baby bonus. It was going up for one primary reason. A lot of young women had delayed their first child and were now approaching the point where if they didn't have a child, they would have none. And so we had a burst of women having babies in their 30s. And that drove up the fertility rate for a period, but only for a period. The evidence that $5,000 convinces a woman to have a baby is pretty poor, I have to say. And Peter Costello going on about how wonderful his baby bonus was just belies all the evidence.
All right, well, look, thank you so much for this. It's been I do feel as though we haven't yet answered the question, how big should Australia be? And I think that behind that is the question, what do we want to be like as a society? And that's where we really, you're asking for a vision.
And that's where we need a plan, absolutely. The best way to think about our future population is to draw a parabola. It will go up and it will come down. The question is, when and where will it peak? Lower net migration peaks earlier and then declines. Higher net migration, it peaks higher and later and then declines. But it's a parabola. And there isn't a developed nation on the planet whose population projections don't look like a parabola, although China's look more like a cliff than a parabola, but leaving that to one side.
Abul, isn't it also about what we like, what we want? And personally myself, I would prefer a younger population than an older population. So where my beach house is, there's lots of old people. I love coming back to Sydney and going to my grandson's. and in terms of values, what about
John Howard was going to include a question on Don Bradman's batting average in the citizenship test, but he got chickened out and didn't put it in.
I should mention that Abul was quite good cricket. In his younger days.
40 years ago.
Well, look, I think that goes right to the heart of what the question is about how we create this new society where, cricket's part of my life too, but it's not only cricket, and we're going to have to be thinking about things. I know Jack Smart, who was a famous philosopher, I said to him once, Jack, do you really think that how a nation state does in cricket is a reflection of its moral quality? And he sat and thought, he's a very famous philosopher, thought for a few minutes, and he said, yes. Yeah. Look, I want to thank you, Abul, not just for taking on the sole role of a speaker, because that's been fantastic, but also for the showing how important evidence is, and even-tempered debate, and being reasoned about issues of real importance. We're talking at present about trying to work out the theme for our annual forum, which is going to be held in November at Government House. And one of the topics we're considering is the hinge of history. That's a notion that comes from a philosopher called Derek Parfit. And I'll quote him. He's dead, but he said in about 2010, "We live during the hinge of history. If we act wisely in the next few centuries, humanity will survive its most dangerous and decisive period. What now matters most is that we avoid ending human history." Well, now, it might just be inevitable. We're at 300,000. But there are tipping points across technology, politics, climate, and of course, behind all of them is AI. AI is what's changing everything and moving the whole game. Now, I don't think we ought to be hysterical about existential crisis, but I think we need to be thinking about it. And I think sensitivities about immigration and the moral panic it evokes is a bit of a canary in the mine about those tipping points. The fears that are manifest in that terror of immigration are about climate change, about war, political uncertainty, moral turbulence, movements of population, discourses of fear. And what I think is coming out of what you have said is that we need to be thinking much more carefully about the future generations as we try and work out policy settings for the issue of immigration. So thank you very much indeed, and I'm really grateful to you. May we congratulate